Having researched the history of Schoolhouse Lane from Wissahickon Avenue, previously called Township Line Road, down to the Schuylkill River for the last 2 decades, I was at first surprised to realize that historically this area comprised the southern portion of Roxborough Township. But thanks to the difficulty of crossing the Wissahickon Valley just to the north, it was on a daily basis much more connected to Germantown. Only later, as Falls of Schuylkill grew, did it identify with what is now known as East Falls. I've been impressed by how rich the history is for most of the 36 country estates that stood cheek to jowl for many generations. And I've been gratified by how many pieces of information I've been able to uncover. The partial survival of property boundaries over the generations has made research easier, revealing that some aspects of country life on the lane, and by extension in many exclusive suburban areas around the city, remained consistent over many generations, while other aspects evolved over time. I've chosen 3 of those estates in order to illustrate the transformation of buildings and landscapes over time and the notable accomplishments of the estate's occupants, as well as some aspects of their lives on the lane. These 3 estates are Glenwood, built before the Civil War, Roslyn Manor, created during the Gilded Age after the war, and the Levy Mansion at Springmead, an example of the last gasp of country life here in the 1930s. Although both sides of Schoolhouse Lane were prestigious locations for country retreats, the north side properties had the advantage of looking down over the steep and wooded Wissahickon Valley Park, here simply labeled Fairmount Park, and all 3 of these estates were on the north side. Glenwood was a 10-acre site acquired by neighbor and local land speculator Abraham Martin in 1842. Since he sold the property for a small sum 5 years later, and the house built around this time did not feature a classical portico, as was his practice in 2 other adjacent locations, we can assume that it was the new owner, Dr. John K. Mitchell, who commissioned the house. The son of a Scottish physician who had immigrated to Virginia, the younger Mitchell had himself also studied medicine in Scotland and at Edinburgh, and then returning to the US at the University of Pennsylvania. He became a distinguished physician and medical author in Philadelphia with a city house at the then fashionable district at 11th and Walnut. To save repetition, I'll just add here that for many decades, Schoolhouse Lane neighbors had city addresses in whatever was the fashionable center city neighborhood at that time, starting near the Delaware and slowly gravitating toward Rittenhouse Square. Like many owners on the lane prior to the Civil War, he was not among the top echelon of wealthy Philadelphians. Instead, he was among the 440 citizens recorded as being worth between $40,000 and $50,000. However, he did marry well. His wife, Sarah Matilda Henry, daughter of a wealthy Presbyterian merchant, was a Quaker and the aunt of future mayor and eventual neighbor, Alexander Henry. They seem to have wasted little time in building a country estate, ensuring a house and an entry lodge, shown here in the blue circles, in 1848. We have no record of who may have designed the mansion, but Mitchell was a descendant of Dr. John Kearsley, the architect of Christ Church in Old City, and was a prominent member of the Grand Masonic Lodge of Pennsylvania. Therefore, he presumably appreciated good architecture. There is a record of him commissioning renowned architect John Notman to design his wife's tomb, but it's not clear the monument was ever completed. Nonetheless, I wonder if Notman, who designed other houses at exactly this time and is credited with introducing the Italianate style to the States, also designed Glenwood, a good example of that style, as we'll see in a minute. Glenwood had a low wall of stone, brick, and iron along the lane, unfortunately in the shadows here. And the property was among the few to have a lodge right on the lane to monitor entrance to the estate. The low wall and elaborate arrangement of carved stone gate posts survive, along with the lodge, though the lodge's decorative half-timbering and Queen Anne Revival-style windows clearly are details from a later renovation. This illustration from the University Archives at Penn confirms what we saw on the atlas, a grassy plat with a circular drive in front of the mansion. The deed called it a mansion house, whereas the insurance policy called it a villa. It was a 2.5-story dwelling built of brick with a rough cast, that is, type of stuccoed exterior in the Italianate style, meaning it had an orderly and symmetrical arrangement of Renaissance-inspired features. On the interior, as seen on the plan to the right, at the first story, the central hall layout featured 2 rooms per side, which could be divided, presumably by sliding doors, shown by the dotted lines. Large windows, the exterior view shows them extending to the floor, contained 15 and 18-paned double-hung sash, which would have provided impressive views of the natural setting, as well as plenty of fresh air and natural daylight. The hall led to a rear porch and adjacent water closet, indicated number 2 and in a blue circle on the plan, which was a framed structure that projected from the rear of the main block of the house. Interior plumbing seems to have been unusual at this time for dwellings nearby, and the fact that the room is frame, not brick, makes more sense when you realize this was mainly a summer house. Upstairs, there was no indication of plumbing, but the second story included 4 bedrooms, some with clothes closets, while the attic had additional rooms and a pantry, presumably for the servants. Sitting on a sloped site, the house included a basement-level kitchen and adjacent laundry, which opened out to grade at the rear. A few years later, the Mitchells sold their estate to George Harrison. Chemical manufacturer George L. Harrison typified the type of neighbor moving to the lane, and particularly those who followed him after the Civil War. His real estate was worth $300,000, and his personal worth was $70,000, indicating another level of wealth compared to the Mitchells. Only 22 households in the city were listed as having more than this at this time. His paternal ancestors were prominent Quakers, his maternal ancestors Lutheran, and his family tree included an uncle who served in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and the US Senate and was postmaster of Philadelphia. George himself left his studies at Harvard due to poor health, but later was admitted to the bar in Philadelphia. He took over his father's pioneering chemical works in Kensington and briefly joined the Powers and Waitman Chemical Manufacturing Company, managing their new Falls of Schuylkill plant at the far end of Schoolhouse Lane near Ridge Avenue. A recent widower, Harrison bought Glenwood and married the Mitchell's daughter, Letitia Henry Mitchell, and the couple retained ownership until their deaths. They also had a city house at 9th and Pine, later 16th and Locust. Harrison created the Franklin Sugar Refining Company for his sons, which generated great wealth. He belonged to St. Luke's Episcopal Church across the street from here, where we're sitting right now, and was on the General Board of Missions. He served as treasurer of the Hospital of the Protestant Episcopal Church and a trustee of the Divinity School. Harrison's philanthropy and reforming efforts were also evident in leadership roles in the House of Refuge and the Board of Public Charities, because he was remembered as having led reforms for the treatment of the insane poor in almshouses and prisons. Back to the mansion. In 1870, the couple lived there, shown in this photo with its Italianate attic replaced by a Second Empire-style sloping mansard roof and prominent dormer windows. The couple and 5 of their offspring were made comfortable by 3 domestic servants, a Black woman from Virginia and 2 Irish-born women. Meanwhile, 3 ancillary dwellings on the site accommodated additional staff. There were 4 domestic servants, all Irish women, in one house, an Irish couple, servant and housekeeper, with 5 children in a second house, and a third dwelling with an Irish couple, their son, who was a domestic servant, their eldest daughter, a dressmaker, and 2 teenage daughters. This arrangement of a grand house for the family with live-in servants and additional on-site staff living in separate buildings was very common on the lane. The dominance of first and second generation Irish American servants, especially women, was consistent throughout the neighborhood. Some lived with family members, but many did not. And few remained from one census to the next, suggesting that workers moved on to less taxing jobs when they could. The Harrison family continued to be significant to Philadelphia's history. This can be demonstrated by examining the life of son Charles Custis Harrison, though his life was typical of many young people reared on the lane. He and his fiancée, later wife, Ellen Nixon Wong, great-granddaughter of Robert Morris, financier of the American Revolution, left behind a stack of letters from when they were courting, now at the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That correspondence revealed that the couple traveled often between Glenwood, the Walm Country House in Montgomery County, and their family's city houses. Harrison was educated at the University of Pennsylvania and then took over his family's sugar refinery. After accruing substantial wealth, he became an influential provost of Penn. Ellen, known as a society figure, was credited with having overseen campus landscaping efforts, and she was manager of the university hospital. Following the practice of Schoolhouse Lane extended families seeking to remain close to the lane, Ellen and Charles bought a smaller country house, Ellerslie, still there, on the lane down near Gypsy Lane, for their young family. Her own upbringing in Montgomery County and the eventual relocation of the family to the main line point to the many familial and social connections that many Lane families had to the best neighborhoods heading north from the city and along the main line. Horticultural pursuits were popular and competitive. Look at the blue arrows, which point out several small buildings with long and narrow plans covered by hipped roofs. These were greenhouses that supplied mansions with flowers. Each estate normally had several. Ravenhill had 7 at one point. At Glenwood, gardener William Jameson won awards from the Germantown Horticultural Society for the tropical plants, palms, ferns, and orchids he tended in his greenhouses. Many of his competitors were also from the lane. In fact, there were enough competitors here that when neighborhoods were listed citywide for awardees, a distinction was made between Germantown and Schoolhouse Lane. With time, life on the lane began to change. Between 1889 and 1895, the old summer residence at Glenwood was converted into a year-round dwelling, a transition that occurred at most of the estates. And following Letitia Harrison's death, the land was sold to Edith S. Hutchinson, daughter of financier Edward T. Stotesbury of Stotesbury Regatta fame, and her insurance broker husband. The Hutchinsons erected a new, very large mansion, shown here in blue, in the blue circle, and designed by society architect Arthur H. Brocky at the northern edge of the site. But it was demolished about a decade later, along with the rest of the estate, except for the lodge, shown in the little blue circle, to make way for Henry Avenue and the bridge over the Wissahickon. Too bad. Heading west, we reach Roslyn Manor, the 60-acre estate of Archibald Campbell, which he assembled from multiple adjacent properties in the 1860s. An Irish Presbyterian immigrant, self-made man, and civic reformer, he was married to a New Jersey native named Angelina. Campbell managed, then bought and expanded multiple cotton mills in Manayunk with great success. One of them, known as the Union and Crumpton Mills, was the largest in the city. The Campbell's land on the lane included a 20-year-old house that they greatly expanded, reportedly to a total cost of $150,000. The couple and their 6 children, along with an English governess and 4 female Irish servants, lived in the expanded mansion. I have not yet been able to locate portraits of anyone in the family, sadly. But fortunately, this image, an Augustus Koellner watercolor, is in the possession of the Free Library of Philadelphia and is described as located at the corner of Gypsy and Schoolhouse Lane. It matches the Roslyn Manor fire insurance plan exactly that's held at HSP. A few writers have described this country seat as an exotic and impressive structure, which is confirmed by the image. By the way, note the deer in the foreground. As late as the last decades of the 20th century, neighbors I interviewed recalled seeing plenty of them along with fox, pheasants, and other woodland creatures roaming the area. Having the park adjacent no doubt played a part. It's difficult to pin a style on this composition because we are looking from a distance, but let's call it an Italian villa-style mansion, thanks to the asymmetrical arrangement of forms around a dominant four-story tower and the round arches and other Renaissance-inspired details. One observer called the tower Turkish, which probably meant he thought it was unusual or flamboyant. Faced in granite, the mansion also featured, though not visible in this image, ornamental iron railings with octagonal posts, wood cornices with 2-foot-deep brackets, ironwork cresting at the roof, and a wraparound porch with 28 Corinthian columns. The fire insurance policy reveals the grand layout and extravagant details. Notice the wraparound porch with entrances from two sides. At the first floor interior, which had 12-foot ceilings, a T-shaped hall and grand staircase had walnut paneling, a bronze chandelier, and walls decorated with scagliola, plaster with glue and dyes to resemble marble, articulated in the Corinthian order. The stair hall separated 3 major public rooms. Though rooms shared architectural fineries such as round-arched windows and ceiling cornices and centerpieces of elaborate stucco, each major room was highly distinctive. Here they are. The walnut parlor on the lower right-hand corner had a 3-sided bay window, 2 white Italian marble mantels on pilasters, frescoed walls and ceiling, and glass chandeliers. The oak dining room on the upper right had ash veneered doors with architraves, 2 Tennessee marble mantels, and bronze chandeliers. Extending across the entire west side of the main block to the left, the library had a 3-sided bay with rolling blinds, 1 walnut mantel and 1 Tennessee marble mantel, and a frescoed ceiling. Other post-war mansions on the lane similarly differentiated major rooms with varied woods, expensive stone, and sometimes faux finishes. On the lower left, the far smaller office off to the side was near a vestibule paved in white and blue marble. Meanwhile, the service wing on the north side had a servant's room and kitchen, along with a toilet room, bathroom, butler's pantry, and service staircase of mixed walnut and ash. All large houses nearby had this arrangement of a multi-story service wing with modest rooms attached to a main residential volume with grander spaces for the owner's family and their guests. At the 11-foot-high second floor, there were 6 bedchambers, a bathroom, and a separate water closet, among other spaces. Windows had rolling blinds and shutters and boxes. The 10-foot-high third story was divided into 4 rooms, bathroom, and storeroom. Correspondingly, the service wing had 2 rooms on each of the second and third stories, while the servant's bathroom was in the basement. No surprise there, I guess. The dwelling was provided with lightning rods, gas lighting, and hot air heat. The high ceilings would have helped, of course, to keep the rooms cooler during the summer. One can imagine how the house functioned simultaneously as Mr. Campbell's place of business away from the mills, as the house of a well-to-do businessman impressing upper-crust guests, and as a home for a large family and their servants. Only a few years later, in 1874, Campbell died there. At that time, the property was assessed at $200,000, excluding his art gallery and impressive library. The The latter, comprised of over 1,000 volumes, was sold off in 1883. His interests encompassed military history, philosophy and culture, European and American history and travel, architecture and the allied arts, including gardening and literature. It reveals the broad interests that a self-made man like Campbell would aspire to, or at least would feel compelled to advertise to others. He was also remembered in his obituary as a patron of the arts and sciences. Roslyn Manor was bought by Caleb J. Milne, son of Scottish immigrant father and Anglo-American Quaker mother. Another self-made man, he was a cotton and woolen goods merchant, business leader, and philanthropist. He and his wife lived at 21st and Walnut, in addition to this country house. In July 1888, local newspapers reported on a particular garden party that could stand in for the many gracious events hosted at Lane Estates over the years. An orchestra played in the summer house on the lawn. Guests had a light meal at small tables on the mansion's porches and under the trees. Typically, Mr. and Mrs. Milne spent part of the summer here and part abroad, according to newspaper reports, which also chronicled the custom of holding a farewell dinner before sailing. Mr. Milne was an avid traveler and collector of fine and decorative arts. In 1900, he lived here as a widower with his 2 sons and their wives. At the time, the Times called the house, quote, one of the handsomest in Germantown. Son Caleb J. Milne Jr., not shown, was a typical child growing up in the Schoolhouse Lane community. He attended Episcopal Academy and entered the textile business. His city residence was near Rittenhouse Square. A philanthropist who belonged to the Republican Party and worshiped in the Episcopal Church, he belonged to the clubs one would expect from a resident with strong Scottish ties, namely the St. Andrew's Society of Philadelphia, and the others that all men of good breeding favored: the Union League, Germantown Cricket Club, Corinthian Yacht Club, Philadelphia Cricket Club, etc. Like many laners of this generation, he chose to summer in Cape May. Increasingly, neighbors would choose seaside resorts in New England or camps in the Adirondacks or the South. His brother, David Milne, shown here on the right, who inherited the mansion on the lane, was a banker turned textile manufacturer. When he died, his widow commissioned an architectural firm for a smaller house at the eastern edge of the site, facing Timber Lane. But Mrs. Milne died before the house was completed. Her estate, exclusive of the real estate, exceeded $2 million. The new house was sold to department store chain owner Benedict Gimble Jr. Meanwhile, the older mansion we've just examined was demolished, and the rest of the site's 41 acres were sold off to Dr. Alma Marani, an innovative plastic surgeon at the Women's Medical College and accomplished amateur sculptor. Dr. Marani and a small group of collaborators transformed the former Roslyn Manor into School Lane Hills, a suburban development of 36 individually designed single-family houses. And I know we have some members who live here. Let's go east from here. The proposed train line along the new Henry Avenue didn't materialize as planned, saving this part of the city from densely built-up housing. So wealthy Philadelphians resumed building homes along Schoolhouse Lane into the 1930s, though these last country estates were less grandiose than their predecessors. In between Glenwood and Roslyn Manor was the Springmead estate, with an 1880s mansion by well-regarded Germantown architect George T. Pearson for the Deniston family. Wife Eleanor Hunt Parrish, raised a Quaker, joined the Episcopal Church. She was an antiquarian, Shakespeare scholar, and supporter of the School of Industrial Art. Husband Edward Evans Deniston was a businessman, athlete, and Unitarian. Sadly, I have never found an image of them nor their house, which was described as palatial and is in the larger blue circle. The smaller circle was the carriage house, and that is what remains from the 19th century history of the estate, though its use has changed. In 1935, soon after socialite Eleanor Denniston died, her daughter sold the property to Isaac D. Levy and his wife, Rita Kaplan. Ike Levy, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania, began a successful career as a trial lawyer before becoming a founding member of radio station WCAU and the Yellow Cab Company. A civic-minded man, he was a member of the Fairmount Park Commission for many years, principal backer of the Playhouse in the Park, and as the newspapers expressed it, a, quote, champion of the downtrodden, end quote. He was also an owner of the Philadelphia Eagles and friend of entertainers Frank Sinatra and Ava Gardner, and apparently the best friend of neighbor John B. Kelly, who had built his own house nearby a few years earlier. Rita Kaplan Levy, an alumna of Girls High School, was active with relief organizations during World War II and worked in London for CBS broadcaster Edward R. Murrow. The Levys belonged to Congregation Rodef Shalom, an indication of how the demographics of the lane had changed over time, from being predominantly Quaker to growing numbers of Episcopalians and Presbyterians to eventually including several Jewish families. In 1936, the Levys commissioned noted architect George Howe of PSFS fame to design a new residential complex around a mansion estimated to cost $100,000 or $2.3 million in today's world. One entered the site along a long driveway, passing the carriage house and a formally arranged grouping of tennis court, pavilion, bathhouse, and swimming pool, then descending past the side of the house and looping around to a cul-de-sac at the north-facing front door. A freestanding garage with chauffeur's quarters terminated the access of the driveway. The 2 1/2-story stone and brick mansion of 28 rooms and 7 baths sat on a sloped site, so a raised terrace ran along its south and west sides. Howe's architecture here was less radical than the sleekly modern international-style houses recently produced by the Howe and Lescaz partnership. The character of the new Levy house was labeled, quote, modernized Georgian, end quote, by scholar Robert A.M. Stern. Another way of saying it was the stately colonial revival as interpreted by an avant-garde art moderne hand. Here's what I mean. The largely symmetrical main block of the dwelling was a gable-ended brick volume with a slate roof enlivened by dormers and 2 central chimney stacks, like a Georgian house. But the traditionally aligned window openings held modern steel casements. Continuing in that spirit, Howe had the exterior brick walls painted with Bondex to provide a smooth, modern-looking surface that was devoid of decoration, except for a modest modillion cornice. Furthermore, the arched entrance boasted a semicircular, flat-roofed turret with a concave bottom, not very Georgian-looking at all. The rear south-facing elevation included a basement at grade that was screened by the arched stone wall of the terrace and 2 upper stories sympathetic to the north facade. Extending to the east was an L-shaped wing hidden by the trees on the right in this image, in architectural harmony with the main block. On the interior, the entry hall was dominated by a curved staircase and a conservatory that aligned with the front door. The library and living room, of course, the living room having replaced the Victorian parlor in the older houses, are on the left side of the plan. And to the right, we see the dining room. Behind the staircase, a powder room and coat room were tucked away. The service wing included kitchen, pantry, flower room, service staircase, servant's room, laundry, and porch, indicating the size of the staff. The second floor had a sprawling master suite of bedroom with 2 baths and 2 dressing rooms, as well as a gymnasium and guest room. The 2 children's rooms and playroom were tucked away in the service wing. Don't know what to say about that. The third floor was the servants' realm, 5 bedrooms for maids, 2 baths, and a sitting room. The basement featured a playroom and a game room with bar and adjacent wine cellar. It was also published in both Architectural Record and House and Garden. House and Garden noted the contrast between antique furnishings and the modern colors and textures. Indeed, the interior design included ornament-free details and modern material choices, reflecting growing trends between the world wars. The New York decorating firm of Paley and Reiners selected finishes and furnishings like celadon green looped fabric drapes and an off-white deep pile rug. Sorry, we don't have color photos of this. That also bridged the gap between tradition and modernity. The broad, flat surfaces of walls and ceilings contrasted with the bold, curved lines of furniture and built-in elements. Floor surfaces varied from fancy patterns in walnut to simple linoleum. Further notable details included glass walls in the kitchen and pantry and art tile. Ike was the brother of Leon Levy, the new owner of the White Corners estate, still standing today at the southeast corner of the Lane and Henry Avenue. To put things into perspective, the same interior decorators worked for Leon and his wife just 2 to 3 years later, producing a far different and clearly more modern effect. I am unsure whether this difference was due to the designer's evolving practice or their clients' preferences. Modernity also impacted mechanical equipment and systems. The gas-fueled heating was a split system of steam and warm air with humidity control. Other features reported included the RCA remote control radio, state-of-the-art kitchen appliances, and the dryer-equipped laundry. In 1940, Mr. and Mrs. Levy lived in their new home with their 2 children, cared for by an Austrian maid, Swedish cook, and French governess. Later, the old house became the Franklin Institute's Germantown laboratories and then research facilities for Temple University, which demolished it. In 1954, a new brick-faced concrete block house was erected on the site, and it survives. Meanwhile, Ike and Rita commissioned a smaller house on what was left of the estate next door, formerly Glenwood, recently split in 2 by Henry Avenue, from Earl W. Bolton Jr., an associate of George Howe. The 1-story ranch house with substantial below-grade spaces was eventually acquired by the Philadelphia College of Textiles and Science and named the Goldie Paley House and used to accommodate the college's immense collection of historic textiles and apparel. It still does that now that the campus is part of Thomas Jefferson University. These 3 examples provide a clear overview of the kind of neighborhood Schoolhouse Lane was leading up to the 1950s. Families of privilege lived on well-appointed country estates, had overlapping ties with their neighbors through business and marriage, and relied on many servants to maintain their lives. Even before World War II, families of influence had begun to move on to other suburban locations or even into the newly completed Alden Park on the former site of the Strawbridge Country House. Some of the estates were converted into school campuses, thus retaining some of their original character. Others were replaced by apartment structures, and still others were subdivided into much smaller lots with suburban houses for middle-income families. Despite these changes, the history of the lane survives physically in some places and through documentation in others, helping to fill in parts of our city's history that are not widely known. Thank you for your attention.